Hi everyone, this week's interactive lecture is about classroom discourse, or how we use talk in the classroom setting to support student learning. I'd like to start by pausing to do a quick free write. So free writes are a good way to help students get ideas down before you talk about them. They also let you assess students' prior knowledge about a topic. So this time I'd like you to set a timer for 10 minutes, so you're going to pause the recording in a moment. And then you're going to free write about the following questions. One is, how has discourse been organized in classes you've taken? So things like who got to talk, when, who controlled the conversation, and how. And then secondly, what do you think is the relationship between talking about a topic and learning about that topic? So right now I'd like you to pause the recording and write, just free write for 10 minutes. You don't need to worry about correctness or spelling or anything like that. This is just about getting ideas out. So probably a lot of you talked about two specific discourse patterns when you remembered different ways that teachers approach talk in the classes you've taken. In K-12 and in college level contexts, these two types of discourse tend to dominate instructional time. The first is lecture, and this is where a teacher talks for a length of time about a specific topic with limited student involvement. And of course, right now, you're experiencing this format. This is a very common format, especially at high school and college levels. The other is what's called IRE, which stands for Initiation, Response, Evaluation, or sometimes people call it IRF, Initiation, Response, Follow-up. Another way this is talked about is recitation. So for this discourse pattern, the teacher asks a question that he or she knows the answer to, students respond, and the teacher evaluates or elaborates on the student response. So here's an example. The teacher asks, who can tell me the stages of the writing process? And one student says, drafting? And the teacher responds, yes, drafting is important, but before you even start writing, what should you do? And student 2 says, plan what you're going to write. And then the teacher follows up and says, absolutely. So you might need to do some research, list out ideas, outline or organize your ideas, all before you even start to write a rough draft. And so this is the most common discourse pattern in our K-12 system, and you'll also see it quite a bit at the college level. And you'll notice the teacher starts with a question. That's the initiation. We have a response. So the first student actually has a correct answer. Drafting is part of the writing process, but the teacher didn't quite ask the question they meant to ask, which is, what's the first step in the writing process? And so the teacher evaluates that response, in this case actually incorrectly, and then the second student gives another response, and the teacher evaluates that response as correct and then elaborates on those ideas. So both of these instructional practices, lecture and IRE, while important, frame the teacher as the primary social actor in the classroom and frame students as passive recipients and demonstrators of knowledge. This limits student engagement with content and privileges students who are closely culturally aligned with this style of teaching. So you might be wondering why this matters. Research has demonstrated that these discourse structures are not the most effective methods for supporting student learning and achievement. Instead, what's called authentic dialogic engagement with content through discourse strongly supports student learning and achievement. So I'm going to talk through 5 different concepts related to dialogic instruction. And we'll talk about each of these in turn. So we're going to talk about dialogic classroom discourse, authentic questions, uptake, revoicing, and wait time today. So first of all, dialogic classroom discourse is the overarching concept that encompasses the other concepts we'll be talking about today. So this is describing a classroom where talk is shared among participants. In this sort of classroom, students and teachers build upon the contributions of others. Over time, this sort of talk develops understandings and negotiates meaning through interaction. An important aspect of this is that it has to be on topic to have an effect on learning. And this makes a lot of sense if you think about it. So if you're just having dialogic classroom discourse, but it's about the TV show that students watched last night, and it has nothing to do with, say, the literature you're teaching in class, then the impact on their learning and achievement will not be very strong. But as long as it's on topic and related to the content of the class, this sort of classroom talk is highly correlated with student achievement. So we're going to look at what are the characteristics of this kind of talk that make it dialogic. So the first aspect of this sort of classroom are what are called authentic questions. And this is probably the center of a dialogic classroom. Good questions frame discourse very differently than the IRE format we saw earlier. And so these sorts of questions are open-ended. They lead to a number of responses that a teacher wouldn't necessarily have already in their head. They might have some ideas of what students would say, but they're not prescribing a particular set of responses. And then they're also open to discussion. So we're going to work on an example of one of these. So right now what I'd like you to do is pause the recording and answer this question. What do you do when you get ready to write a paper? So I'm going to give you I'd like you to take about 3 minutes and jot down as many things that you do when you're getting ready to write a paper for a class. So pause the recording now. So you probably talked about a number of different things in your quick write you just did. You might have said things like set a timer and write until it's done. That's something I do, especially when I need to make progress on a piece of writing and I'm having trouble getting started. You might do things like brainstorm ideas or talk to a friend, or in some cases you might feel like you have to have a draft of your introduction before you can write the rest of your essay that you're working on. Sometimes you might do something that's not writing, like go for a walk or play solitaire, just to kind of ease your mind and get in the headspace to be ready to write. Some people might read and take notes, or they might draw a bubble map of ideas or make an outline. Other people might drink some wine. These are all things that students in the past have said in response to this question. So there's not necessarily a specific set of answers that I'm looking for when I ask this question. It's still getting at this idea of the writing process and initiating a planning stage in writing, but it does not have a prescribed answer like the IRE question that I modeled earlier. And so another important piece of this is that it doesn't mean any answer can be correct. So we can imagine there are certainly answers that wouldn't be correct to this question. So things that are completely off topic that don't talk about getting ready to write a paper. Here are a few other examples of authentic questions from English classes that I've taught. So the first one is from a discussion on stylistic choices. So in this one, I asked students, why do you think the author chose to use a sentence fragment rather than a complete sentence on page 2? So this actually points students to a particular moment in the text and asks them to think about what that particular stylistic choice does to them as readers and why a writer might choose to make that sort of move. The second one is from a reading-based discussion. This is from an essay where the person is arguing that things like watching TV and playing video games actually give us more cognitive development compared to those media 20 years ago. And so this question is, what reaction did you have to Johnson's argument that watching TV makes us smarter? And so this asks students to think about their own previous conceptions about these sorts of media and then connect it to the argument that the writer was making in that essay. And then the final one is from a discussion about writing effective arguments. And so in this question, I asked my students what are reasons someone might give for and against stricter gun control. So in this particular discussion, I was getting students to start to think about how they might anticipate opposing points of view in an argument. And so part of doing that is you have to start to generate ideas that don't necessarily agree with your own.